Video games. Video games are a reflection of the technology of their time. They clearly showcase evolution of real-time render. If we analyze games from the last 10 to 15 years, it may seem like not much has changed. But if we look at a larger time gap, we can see how video games are an extremely recent art form and how they have evolved so quickly. For instance, this is a game from 10 years ago. This is a game from 20 years ago, 30, 40, 15 years ago. And this is Tennis for Two from 1958, one of the first electronic games ever created. In other words, the video game media has a little over half a century of history. However, in its early decades, it had an archaic appearance and demanded a lot of imagination from the players. That got me thinking, what if video games were much older? What if they had existed since the early 20th century, like cinema? What would they have looked like? What themes they will be about? With this thought in mind, I decided to create this video. To conduct this mental exercise, we need to establish some rules. For example, we must ignore the technology of the time, but only in a specific era of video games. This means there will be no online games, as internet in the first half of the 20th century would have drastically altered human history. So we will consider video games as home video, vinyl records, 16mm films or phonograph rolls for the early decades. To figure out what types of games might have existed, we will use cinema, literature, and historical events for guidance. From this, we can analyze major media events and what was happening in the world during those times. We will separate this analysis by decades, spanning from the 1910s to the 1970s, since the 1910s was when cinema began to establish itself as a mass medium, and the late 70s marked the point when video games became what we know today. With that said, let's dive into the video. The second decade of the 20th century was marked by what was then the largest and most brutal war in history, retroactively called the First World War. At the time, was simply known as the Great War. This period lasted 4 years, from 1914 to 1918, and defined a generation. It was a conflict triggered by the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria and Hungary, which later led to even greater events in history. Keep this in mind, because if the assassination attempt had failed, this entire video would be completely different. I'm dead serious. However, this was also the decade when cinema became much more popular, with actors like Charlie Chaplin and Tom Mix becoming public favorites through comedy and Western films. Westerns, by the way, will be a recurring theme in this video. In literature, many famous characters and books already existed or were created during this era, such as Arsène Lupin, The Phantom of the Opera, Little Nemo, Peter Pan, Zorro, the works of Jules Verne, The Wizard of Oz, and Sherlock Holmes. By this time, Sherlock Holmes had already been adapted into 2 films, a 1-minute short called Sherlock Holmes Baffled and The Hound of the Baskervilles. Speaking of Holmes, his creator, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, released a book in 1912 called The Lost World, which included dinosaurs, and was later adapted into a 1925 film. Another character created during this time who gained immense popularity was Tarzan, created by Edgar Rice Burroughs in 1912 and adapted to the big screen by 1918. Burroughs also created John Carter in the book A Princess of Mars, a notable example of early sci-fi. Based on this, we can conclude that if games didn't spared, they might have featured characters like Captain Nemo from 2000 Leagues Under the Sea in an adventure game, Sherlock in a detective game, Arsène Lupin in a Sly Cooper style game, or Tarzan in an action platformer. There might have been dinosaur games, since dinosaurs were already popular enough for Doyle to write about them. It's also likely that propagandist war games such as shooting games or war evasion games could have existed, possibly even featuring the Red Baron. The 1910s are sometimes overlooked, even in history, as people tend to remember the Second World War more than the First. However, there are still many interesting things to explore about this decade. A decade marked by the Wall Street crash, German Expressionism, and the creation of the Soviet Union, the Roaring Twenties was an era when cinema and radio became the world's leading media. In cinema, westerns and comedies remained very strong, even with the arrival of major epics. Actors became global stars, and films from Germany, with their unique style, were very successful, addressing themes such as horror, suspense, plot twists, and even dystopian societies, with special effects that remain expressive to this day. Several characters mentioned earlier, like Zorro, Tarzan, and Sherlock, received film adaptations, and animation began to gain prominence. During this period, in 1923, an animation studio was founded called Walt Disney Studios, which in 1928 created the short Steamboat Willie, featuring Mickey Mouse, who would become the face of the corporation. In literature, characters emerged, such as Solomon Kane, King Cole, Buck Rogers, Winnie the Pooh, and from H.P. Lovecraft's stories, the Cthulhu. The games of the 1920s would likely draw inspiration from the Western cinema, which remained the dominant film genre until the 60s. However, they would be like Red Dead Redemption, that would be much later with spaghetti westerns. Instead, the games would feature a more romanticized portrayal of the Wild West, with heroes and villains in a clean. There could also be games focused on horror, inspired by German expressionist film like Nosferatu and the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, or cosmic horror influenced by Lovecraft's work. Characters like Winnie the Pooh and Mickey could have side-scrolling platformer or collectathon games. Solomon Kane and King Cole might star a violent action games, and Buck Rogers could appear in a fun space adventure game. The 20s had many fascinating elements, but I won't go on too much, or the video would get too long and repetitive. Starting in 1930, things got more interesting. This year marked the first ever World Cup, sparking global interest in the sport and possibly inspiring a FIFA game for that era. Consequently, games based on other popular sports, such as boxing and Olympic sports since 1904 and basketball, introduced to the Olympics in 1936 during the Berlin Games, could have also emerged. The 1936 Olympics were held in Nazi Germany, which rose to the power following the defeat of the Second Reich in the First World War. The regime was led by a veteran of that war, Adolf Hitler, who would later be responsible for starting the Second World War at the end of the decade by invading Poland. This conflict would extend into the following decade, become the largest and bloodiest armed conflict in human history. I mentioned earlier that Germany has a significant influence in cinema, so it's very likely that would have influenced game as well. For example, there could have been games about a sport called Mensur, a traditional German fencing style that was very popular at the time. Unlike modern fencing, Mensur was more hardcore. Players couldn't dodge, just attack and defend. The game ended when someone managed to cut their opponent's face, which is why many German generals have scars on their faces. Moving away from that period sports and geopolitics, in cinema, the 1931 movie Dracula launched, beginning the first cinematic universe in history, the Universal Monsters. This included characters like Dracula, Frankenstein, Bride of Frankenstein, the Invisible Man, and the Mummy. And in the following decades, more characters were added. Westerns were still huge cultural phenomena, with John Wayne starting his career. His breakout role came in 1939 with Stagecoach, directed by John Ford. He would later become the biggest star in Hollywood. In 1930, Hell's Angels, directed by Howard Hughes, became the most expensive film at the time, costing $3.8 million. He was not only a director, but also a pioneer in aviation and producer of the 1932 film Scarface. Yes, the Brian De Palma version starring Al Pacino is a remake. Well, the 1932 version is loosely based on a novel inspired by Al Capone's life. Hugh's fascinating story later became the subject of Martin Scorsese's movie, The Aviator, starring Leonardo DiCaprio, which is excellent. The 1930s also marked the birth of Technicolor in film, with classics like The Adventures of Robin Hood, The Wizard of Oz, Gone with the Wind.
Where shall I go? What shall I do?
Frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn.
And Disney's first animated feature film, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Disney also created its most iconic characters during this period, such as Goofy and Donald Duck. This era marked the beginning of the golden age of comics. Iconic characters were created, like Flash Gordon, who was quickly adapted into a cinema serial, starring Buster Crabbe in 1936. Other notable examples are the Phantom, Dick Tracy, and the Blue Beetle. From Timely Comics came Namor and the original Human Torch, both debuting in the Marvel Comics #1 in 1939. The decade also gave us two of the most iconic superheroes of all time, Superman and Batman, created respectively in 1938 and 1939. The 30s also features characters from the radio, such as the Shadow and the Green Hornet. In literature, J.R.R. Tolkien's The Hobbit was published in 1937. And remember that in the previous decade, I mentioned Solomon Kane and King Ku, two characters created by the writer Robert E. Howard. In this decade, in 1932, his greatest and most famous character was created, Conan the Cimmerian. Of all the decades discussed till now, the 30s offered the most contemporary characters, stories, and concepts. With the advent of Technicolor, video games could now be colorful. The Universal Monsters, already an established cinematic universe, could have inspired fascinating horror games. Films like Scarface could inspire shooting or crime-themed games like GTA or Mafia. But the biggest treasure of this era is its literary characters, especially those from comic books. Flash Gordon could star in a sci-fi game, The Phantom in an action game, and Dick Tracy in a detective game. Early versions of iconic superheroes like Superman and Batman would also appear, but slightly different from the ones we know today. For example, Robin and the Joker didn't appear in Batman comics until the 40s. Let's now not forget about the fantasy. Works that still inspire stories today were released during this decade, with Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, The Hobbit, and Conan. The medieval fantasy was setting, the already well established and people said. Whether set in fairy tale world, Middle Earth, or in the dark fantasy realm, the groundwork for fantasy games were already laid, and of course Western would still dominate as the most common genre for games. The decade begins with a war that would become the largest of all, the Second World War. Countries like Nazi Germany, the Fascist Italy, and Imperial Japan formed an alliance. In 1941, the Japanese Imperial Navy Air Force attacked the American naval base at Pearl Harbor, prompting the United States to officially join the Allies against the Axis. During the war, media in all the countries involved became heavily propagandistic. In the United States, newspapers, magazines, and film studios were paid to encourage enlistment. This era saw the creation of characters like Captain America, films such as Casablanca and The Invisible Agent, and several cartoons that would be banned today. Moving away from the war period for a moment, cinema continued to thrive. The Universal Monsters franchise remained immensely popular, with characters meeting for the first time in Frankenstein Meets the Wolfen. Westerns were still a big deal. The decade also saw the rise of noir films. And comics was the golden age. Most comic books were focused on superheroes such as Batman, Superman, The Flash, Jay Garrick, Hawkman, Green Lantern, Doctor Fate, Captain America, the original Human Torch, and Captain Marvel, known now as Shazam. Disney Comics, especially Donald Duck stories illustrated by Carl Barks, also gained significant popularity. By the end of the war, and after the bombings of Nagasaki and Hiroshima, the United States occupied Japan, influencing its culture significantly. During this period, a young Japanese artist, inspired by Disney animations and comics, began his career as a mangaka. His name was Osamu Tezuka. He debuted with works like Macha no Nikucho and Shin Takarajima. Video games from the first half of the 1940s would likely have been propaganda driven, much like Medal of Honor, Battlefield, or Call of Duty. There might have been featuring superheroes fighting Nazis, as seen in comics, with characters like Superman or especially Captain America. Also games featuring universal monsters like Darkstalkers by the end of the decade. Influenced by noir films, games like Max Payne, but set in the 40s, could have been developed, and of course, Western as you can imagine. The birth of rock and roll, sci-fi horror films, cowboys, and atomic bombs were defining features of the 1950s. This was also the era when video games were first created, but as mentioned earlier, they were very rudimentary, so we will disregard them. The movie theaters during this decade was dominated by movies about creatures from outer space, from the depths of the earth, and even those created by humans themselves. However, some standout films of this time included Godzilla, a Japanese film that gained international fame, War of the Worlds, based on H.G. Wells' novel, Earth vs. the Flying Saucers, and Forbidden Planet. Despite the sci-fi trend, westerns were more popular than ever, with classics like Rio Bravo, The Searchers, Shane, High Noon, Winchester 73, and hundreds of others. American television was also full with western series, such as The Adventures of Rin Tin Tin, Bonanza, and The Lone Ranger. Inspired by American Western films, particularly those by John Ford, Akira Kurosawa started the golden era of Japanese cinema with films like Rashomon, Throne of Blood, The Hidden Fortress, and Seven Samurai, inspiring a new wave of films in the following decade. Also in Japan, Osamu Tezuka created Kimba, the White Lion, and Astro Boy or Tetsuan Atom. In Italy, peplum films, historical epics became popular, such as Hercules 1958 and Hercules Unchained 1959, which led to a wave of ancient era films like Ben-Hur in Hollywood. Even with many of DC's superheroes were revamped in this era, such as The Flash and Green Lantern, superheroes had started to feel outdated. Comics were now dominated by themes of violence and horror, particularly those published by EC Comics. However, this led to the creation of the Comics Code Authority, which imposed strict censorship. EC Comics was left with only its satirical magazine, Mad. By this time, Turok was a thing in comics, so the classic FPS franchise could exist in this timeline. A game like Fallout would be 100% possible and even likely in this setting. Games with themes of gladiators or Greek mythology could have emerged, games like God of War. However, the most popular game genre in the West would likely have been science fiction with aliens or cowboy-themed games. In Japan, the cultural boom would likely have inspired games about Godzilla and samurai, especially considering that many classic samurai films were released during this period.
Neuf à la banque.
I need another 1,000.
I admire your courage, Miss,
Trench. Sylvia Trench. I admire your luck, Mr.
Bond. James Bond.
Alongside the Beatles, James Bond, a character created by Ian Fleming, became one of the biggest men of the decade. He was adored by everyone. The women wanted him, and the men wanted to be him. The Bond franchise also spawned numerous rip-off and parodies. Meanwhile, rock and roll reached unimaginable heights. The hippie movement was born. Woodstock happened. The Vietnam War raged. Civil rights movement surged, and the President Kennedy was assassinated. It was a decade like no other. At the start of the decade, The Magnificent Seven, an adaptation of The Seven Samurai set in the American West, was released. Akira Kurosawa continued to make influential films throughout the decade, notably Yojimbo. The movie caught the attention of Sergio Leone, an Italian director known for peplum films that were still a popular genre at the time. Leone thought that Yojimbo would make a great western, so he tried to make it, since a Kurosawa film had already been adapted to this format, and wanted Henry Fonda for the lead role. However, the studio couldn't afford him, so the role was offered to Charles Bronson, who refused. So Leone cast the star of the TV series Rawhide, Clint Eastwood. This decision gave birth to A Fistful of Dollars, an unofficial remake of Yojimbo, which sparked legal issues with Toho. The film became the starting point of the Dollars trilogy, which also included For a Few Dollars More and The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. one of the greatest movies ever made. The trilogy not only cemented Eastwood as a star, but also popularized the spaghetti western genre, which include many classics such as Django, Return of the Ringo, Once Upon a Time in the West, which is a Sergio Leone movie with Fonda and Bronson. Science fiction also gained momentum in the 1960s, with films like 2001: A Space Odyssey by Stanley Kubrick, and TV shows such as Doctor Who and Star Trek. In comics, the 60s marked the transformation of Atlas Comics, formerly Timely Comics, into Marvel Comics, introducing heroes like the Fantastic Four, Spider-Man, the Incredible Hulk, Thor, Iron Man, and the original X-Men. Unlike DC in the 30s, Marvel created its universe very quickly, especially through the stories of the Fantastic Four. On the DC side, Batman was adapted for television in the classic Adam West series. Meanwhile, in Japan, the Astro Boy manga was adapted into an animated TV series in 1963, becoming the first anime based on a manga. This practice became common, leading to adaptations of works by Osamu Tezuka and other mangaka. Notable examples include Speed Racer or Maha Go Go Go. These era games would likely have been more advanced than ever before. It's easy to imagine numerous 007 games inspired by the films and books, or even spy-themed games like Metal Gear Solid 3, which drew heavily from the Bond series.
007 from Russia with Love.
I don't like those movies. Real spies are nothing like James Bond. It's pure fantasy.
Snake, I don't think the Major's going to like you saying that.
And even though it's fiction, I can't help but comparing myself to Bond.
What exactly don't you like about James Bond? I mean, is it the fantastic gadgets, the cars, the guns?
Major,
Snake, wouldn't you like to have a gun shaped like a pen?
what good is a pen gonna do me in the jungle? I'd look like a fool.
Then what about a snake-shaped gun? You could make it look like you're grappling with a giant snake and then get a shot in on the enemy while they're distracted. Ah,
Okay, now you're being ridiculous.
we'll make you a snake-shaped gun that folds up and fits into an attaché case.
Will you give it a rest?
Oh, I get it. You're worried about how to handle the ladies, aren't you?
No.
I knew it. To tell you the truth, I don't like the idea of playing hanky-panky with enemy femme fatales either.
Music-based games, Guitar Hero-like games, could also have emerged given the rock and roll explosion. The Vietnam War might have inspired both military propaganda games and anti-war games. Westerns, while still popular, might have shifted to reflect the gritty realism of spaghetti westerns, paving the way for Red Dead Redemption style games. The surge in sci-fi and superhero popularity would have led to many games based on geek franchises like the Fantastic Four, Spider-Man, the Hulk, and Star Trek. In Japan, samurai games would still have been common, given the classic films of the genre released during this decade. Horror games might also have emerged, as it was a prolific era for the genre in Japan. Additionally, games based on Osamu Tezuka's works and other mangaka would likely have been popular. As I said earlier, by this time video games began to resemble what we know today. Many of the hypotheses discussed here can already be observed in the early video games from this period, as the Atari 2600 was launched in 1977 and games like Space Invaders were created. Because of this, the video might lose a bit of its speculative charm. In cinema, spaghetti westerns were still being made, but the genre began to decline. Many of today's major contemporary directors had a career turning point in the 70s, including Martin Scorsese, Steven Spielberg, and Francis Ford Coppola. Superman received his most famous and iconic cinematic adaptation. Science fiction reached new heights during this decade, with films like the unfinished superproduction Dune by Alejandro Jodorowsky. Even though Dune was never completed, its concept art and storyboards featuring work by Mobius, H.R. Geiger, and Chris Foss inspired an entire generation of sci-fi creators. The project was meant to star Mick Jagger, Orson Welles, and Salvador Dali, with Pink Floyd composing the soundtrack. With the concept arts you are seeing, you could see that was supposed to be the GOAT. However, the ambitious production was estimated to last 10 hours of screening, and its production value would be absurd, so the picture was rejected by the studios, leading to its cancellation. But many of the art made for the film inspired great sci-fi movies from the decade. Examples are Star Wars and Alien. The 70s also marked the rise of the slasher genre in horror films, with classics like Halloween and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and kung fu movies from Hong Kong bringing Bruce Lee to movie star status. In gaming, the 70s saw the launch of the first electronic role-playing game, a Calabath, World of Doom, in 1979. This was the precursor of the Ultima series, one of the oldest RPG franchises in game history. Role-playing games as a concept were also born during this period, with the release of the Dungeons and Dragons game. In Japan, anime became more widespread than ever. Numerous manga adaptations made it to the screen, including Lupin III, Doraemon, Ashton Joe, Devilman, Versailles Nobara, and Mazinger Z. And there are the original TV anime, like Uchu Senkan Yamato, or Space Battleship Yamato, or Star Blazers, and of course, Mobile Suit Gundam. Games of this era feature numerous science fiction elements, particularly space shooters, which were already become common. Games based on anime, especially those involving mecha like Mazinger Z and Gundam, would have been likely. This decade also saw the rise of RPGs, paving the way for fantasy-themed games inspired by Dungeons and Dragons. Many of these trends in fact can already be observed in the early stages of gaming during this period. In this video, we learn a little about the history of the 20th century entertainment, and how historical events completely dictate the course of the entertainment industry. Whether in books, comics, and television, video games would be no different if they existed. If Franz Ferdinand had not been killed, the First World War wouldn't have happened, and the Second World War wouldn't have happened too, as well as many books, movies, and comics. Japan wouldn't have received so much Western influence, since the Japanese Empire wouldn't have been defeated. The samurai movies wouldn't have been the inspiration for Western movies, and anime and manga, as we know, wouldn't have existed. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please subscribe, share, and hit the like button.